how can we sustain high performance? There's some interesting learnings, I think, from sport, particularly endurance sport, that apply equally well to the endurance activity that many of us feel we're engaged in the workplace. The first principle is that we need to work both efficiently and effectively. Secondly, we need to be decisive and focused. We heard a lot of that focus this morning in that first presentation from Craig. And finally, ideally, we need to be both energized as well as well rested. We're going to explore each of those three topics today. But unfortunately, many of us struggle with those three pillars of sustained performance. How many people here feel truly efficient and effective? Well, according to some data, working hours are up by about 13%. However, 64% of employees say that they still struggle to get their work done. There must be something wrong with that equation, right? Do you feel decisive and focused? Well, according to some other data, we're interrupted once every 11 minutes. Maybe you're lucky to get 11 minutes, but that's not the worst part of that story. Once we've been interrupted, it then takes 23 minutes to get back up to speed on the original task. Do you feel energized? Do you feel well rested? Well, about a fifth of people feel that they've got some type of symptoms of burnout at the average organization. The good news is it doesn't have to be this way. In fact, we can use some principles from performance science to sustain high performance. And we're going to talk about these three principles today. The first, we're going to look at how we can reduce some of the inefficiency that steals so much of our time. Secondly, we're going to talk about increasing that decisiveness and focus. And finally, we're going to be talking about boosting energy and improving recovery. To do this, I'm going to introduce you to a framework. I mentioned I used to be very involved in cycling. I was a full-time racing cyclist. If you've done any kind of endurance sport, you might be familiar with this idea of training zones. You might use a heart rate monitor, for example, to measure the intensity of your effort when you're swimming, cycling, or running. I'd like you to imagine that you could apply a similar approach to knowledge work, to cognitive work. And this is an approach that I describe as cognitive gears. So I'd like you to imagine for a moment, over here, there is a high cognitive gear. This represents the time that you spend focusing on that high impact, high priority work, ideally not being interrupted or distracted. In the middle, we've got a middle cognitive gear. This is the time that we spend switching between tasks, doing the busy work. This morning we heard about this idea that busyness is not productivity. Well, middle gear really represents that time. And then over here, I'd like you to imagine that we've got this low cognitive gear. And this low cognitive gear represents proactive recovery. It might describe that we spend resting, recovering, perhaps even reflecting. But if you were to reflect for a moment and consider, where do you spend most of your time during the average day? I think unfortunately, many of us find that we spend most of our day stuck in a cognitive middle gear that's spent task switching, doing emails, feeling like a lot of the time we're stuck on someone else's schedule. You see, there's a battle for our attention, and it's getting worse. Over the last 2.5 years, the average attention span has dropped from 2.5 minutes to just 47 seconds. 70% of emails are opened within 6 seconds of receiving them. 42% of people admit to checking email and replying in the bathroom. I'm sure you're all laughing because you know someone. I'm sure no one here would do such a terrible thing. But overall, the evidence is pretty clear. The more time we spend on email, the higher our stress, the lower our productivity. You see, we have a wealth of information, but we have a poverty of attention. But it's not just email that's causing problems, right? The number of weekly meetings has increased by 153%. People would like to turn down about a third of the meeting invitations that they receive, but due to organizational norms, they only turn down about 14% of the invitations that they receive. We've got to do something about this. So let's talk about how we can reduce inefficiency and rescue some time. In practice, this means that we need to stop throwing our attention around like it's loose change, and instead start investing it like it's a precious resource. What does this look like in practice? Well, I've got 4 top tips to enhance your communication efficiency based on 25 years of evidence that has been investigating how to improve the way that we use email. Feel free to take a picture of these slides. I'm also happy to share the slides if people would like them afterwards. The first is to reconsider. When did we decide to make email a kind of instant communication tool? It used to be asynchronous, but for some reason, there's this implicit expectation that we always respond rapidly. So reconsider that promise. And related to that, consider scheduling your email use. It doesn't necessarily have to be instant. Could you batch your email use to particular parts of the day? Some people I know only check their email and reply once a day. That might not be practical in your role. You might need to do it 3 times a day. Perhaps you need to do it 5 times a day. But I'd encourage you to have a system for reading and replying to email rather than letting it leak into every single moment. Thirdly, you're going to have to help people to understand that you're shifting away from using email like instant messenger. So set expectations. You could just have an email signature that explains when people can expect a reply from you. And finally, limit. Once you've put those principles into practice, switch off your notifications. When you're actually working on something, don't interrupt yourself. Who decided that notifications being on as the default option was a good idea anyway? Now, I encourage you to try this experiment, even for a few weeks. If it doesn't work for you, you can always go back to your previous way of working, but many people find it's incredibly beneficial for both reducing stress and improving productivity. And in fact, some data indicate this could save 180 hours per year per person. So reflect on that. What could you do with those 180 hours? I'm going to share some more ideas in this presentation, and it might be that some of that rescued time could be reinvested in some of the other ideas that we're going to explore. Also, though, I think many of us struggle with an overwhelming number of meetings. You might need to implement what I describe as a meeting purge to try and reduce the number of meetings that are hanging around in our calendar. The first step is to do what I'd call a meeting audit. Identify those meetings that are recurring, which are just there because they've always been there. Many of us have got some of those meetings in our calendar, and this audit can help you to figure out which ones those are. When you've identified those recurring meetings that are pretty low value, that you might be able to get rid of, cut the clutter. Just get rid of them. Try and get rid of them for 6 to 8 weeks. If you genuinely need them, you can always put them back in. Thirdly, scale back the rest. If you've got recurring meetings that are left, run an experiment. You might not be able to do this with every single meeting, but you could potentially move some weekly meetings to fortnightly, some fortnightly meetings to monthly. You've instantly cut down your meeting calendar, and again, if the frequency needs to increase again, you can always do that. But humour me, do an experiment for a few weeks and see what happens. And finally, when you followed these 3 steps, perhaps most importantly, slash the duration. Who decided that 60-minute meetings were a good idea? Cut your default 60-minute meetings to 45, maybe even down to 30, the 30-minute meetings to 15. You might have heard of something called Parkinson's law. Parkinson's law essentially describes that tasks generally expand to fill whatever time we give them. So if you cut your meeting down to 30 minutes, I guarantee you'll probably get everything done during that time. And if you follow these 4 simple principles, you're going to rescue some time. Time to reinvest, perhaps in productivity, maybe in your well-being too. You also need to look out, though, for a particularly pernicious type of worker who walks and even sits among us today. You may even be one. Are you a meeting maker? You might be sitting next to a meeting maker. When you gather data from workplace analytics software, it turns out that just 5% of people are responsible for about 60% of meetings. And these meeting makers don't just clog up our calendars. They're also the people who've got the worst meeting hygiene. No, this doesn't mean the people who've forgotten their deodorant. It means the people who are most likely to turn up late and let the meetings overrun. So if you know a meeting maker, I'm sure no one here is a meeting maker, I'd encourage you to share this simple framework with them. It's a series of questions that the meeting makers should ask themselves to figure out whether a meeting is truly required. The first question, have you thought it through? I'm not saying that we shouldn't use meetings to think things through, but very often people end up defaulting to a meeting when actually spending a little bit of time reflecting on their own probably could result in them coming up with the solution that they needed. If you have thought it through, you can move to the next step. Do you really need outside input to make some progress? Often, there's an internal document that they could reference. It might even be answered with a simple Google search. If they genuinely do need outside input, then move to the next step. Does it really require real-time interaction? This might be an appropriate opportunity to use a different communication tool. I don't want to advocate for clogging up your inbox, but how many meetings have we all been part of that could have been replaced with a single, well-worded email? Many, I imagine. If you've got to this point, you've decided it requires a real-time conversation, this is the point to ask, does it need to be face-to-face? Again, this might be an appropriate time to look at a different tool. Maybe an instant messenger chat could suffice. But if you've got through these 3 steps and you've decided that a meeting is truly required, this is the time that you schedule, but most importantly, prepare. Prepare means have an agenda for the meeting. Have a clear idea about what you're hoping to achieve. Also, share any documents or pre-reads in advance, and you can cut that meeting down from 60 minutes to 30 and probably 30 to 15. And you can free yourself so much time, so much energy to reinvest in true productivity, into focus, perhaps even in those things that you're obsessed about, as we heard this morning from Craig. There was a case study across 76 companies who implemented some similar tactics. They were able to reduce the number of meetings across the company by 20%. They saw stress in the organization decrease by 26%. Not only that, productivity leapt by 35%. So once you've freed a bit of time, you might have a bit of energy and a few more moments available to invest in becoming more decisive and focused. The first step in this process is perhaps a bit unusual. I'd argue that the first step is identifying your chronotype. Chronotype describes our tendency towards morningness or eveningness. I'm curious, I've got a question for all of you now. How many people here would describe yourselves as morning types? You feel at your best in the mornings? Okay, we've got a few there. A lot of morning types here. It's worth remembering. How many people here would describe yourselves as evening types? You feel best at the end of the day? Yeah, we've got a few evening types as well. How many people here are somewhere in the middle? Yeah, a few in the middle. Well, our chronotype describes that tendency towards morningness or eveningness, and it's actually genetically governed. It's not about self-control. It's not about trying harder. More than 50% is governed by our genes. But regardless of that tendency towards morningness or eveningness, cognitive performance varies by about 20% during the average day. Now, if you're a morning type, you're an early bird, you experience this variation as a peak in the morning, followed by this valley in the middle where your energy kind of drops, and then you get this rebound, this increase in energy later in the day. If you are evening type, you're a late type, you experience that variation in reverse. You start the day with this rebound. You're kind of like taking a while to get going. You start to get going, you have some lunch, you get this valley in the end of the day, then your peak feels great. You're up to energy, you're up to full alertness in the evening, and everyone else is looking at you saying, what is going on? But regardless of that tendency, each of those 3 phases has different characteristics. That variation means that different parts of the day are better or less well suited to different types of work. So regardless of that tendency, that peak period, whether it's at the start of the day for you, or whether you're a late type and it's the end of the day, that peak period when you feel at your best is a great opportunity for what I'd describe as high cognitive gear. It's time spent focusing, spent being decisive, spent making progress on that highest priority, high impact work. Most people experience a dip in the middle of the day after lunch. I'm sure no one's feeling that now. I'm sure you're all scintillated, you're on the edge of your seats, but most of you will experience a dip, it's okay. And that dip, that natural decrease in energy, is a great opportunity to take a break rather than pushing through. I'm going to talk a bit more about breaks in a moment. And then that rebound, when your energy starts to bounce back, but you're not at full alertness like you were in the morning or maybe later in the day, that's a great opportunity for the meetings, for the switching tasks, for the bits of work that just have to get done. 68% of people say that they don't have enough time to focus during the average workday. But I'd argue that if you were able to apply some of those tactics to improve efficiency, to rescue some time, and then if you were to reinvest some of that time in focus, you'd be amazed at the effect that that could have on productivity, but also how satisfied you felt with the work that you did too. When you've decided to allocate some time, you've found that peak period in your day, you've decided that you're going to focus, it is important that you engineer your environment in such a way that you'll be able to concentrate though. I mentioned at the beginning, we're interrupted about once every 11 minutes. It then takes 23 minutes to get back up to speed on the original task. So I'd encourage you to experiment with a technique. Rather than trying to concentrate maybe for the hour completely that you've set out to focus once you've rescued that time, break it down into smaller chunks. You might have heard of this technique before. Back in the 80s, there was an Italian called Francesco Cirillo. He was a university student at the time. And Francesco was trying to study for his university exams. So he sat in his mother's kitchen and he had 4 hours ahead of him that he decided he was going to focus and study and try and absorb all this information, but he felt overwhelmed. So he had the bright idea. He thought, what if I break this down into smaller chunks? But he needed a timer. He wasn't wearing a watch. So he looked around his mother's kitchen and on the shelf, he found a cooking timer. And this cooking timer was able to break this time down into these 25-minute blocks of focus with 5 minutes of recovery. Now, if anyone here speaks Italian, you might know that the Italian word for tomato is pomodoro. And so Francesco pioneered what we now call the Pomodoro technique, which is probably the world's most well-known and popular productivity method. It sounds so simple, but when you find that peak period in your day, maybe just once or twice a week, block an hour. Block 2 hours. Divide it into 25-minute blocks of focus with 5 minutes of recovery. Repeat, and you will be amazed at how much you can get done. One of the challenges is that our environments sometimes aren't conducive to focus. You need to find a way to feed your focus and starve your distractions. This might mean leaving your smartphone in another room, putting it out of sight. They did this really interesting study a few years ago where they looked at people's cognitive performance when their phone was in front of them, when their phone was hidden in the room, and when the phone was in another room. And they found that putting the phone in another room improved their performance in the tasks that they were evaluated on by about 10%. So I'd encourage you, when you find your peak period and you block off that time, at the very least, put your phone out of sight. Even better, leave it in another room. And you'd be amazed at the progress that you can make. Now, this is some data from the US, but when they analyzed 5 different industries, they estimated that they could probably save about $468 billion by optimizing knowledge workers' time with dedicated periods of focus. Now, your outcome measure might not be financial, but there will be an outcome measure that's important to you. And I'd argue that that dedicated focus time is going to help you to discover and make better use of that time and perhaps refine your ability to focus if you feel like you may have lost it along the way. The final part of this presentation today, we're going to talk about boosting energy and improving recovery. Sometimes, paradoxically, to take a step forward further, we need to begin by taking a step back. And I believe that sustainable high performance, the very best high-performing days, actually begin the night before. There was an interesting piece of research done a few years ago that identified 4 critical leadership capabilities, which you can see displayed on the screen right now. The first, being able to generate diverse insights. Secondly, productive efficiency. Third, problem solving. Fourth, emotional intelligence. They actually discovered that 89% of the difference in leadership effectiveness between strong and weak organizations was defined by these 4 capabilities. But all of these capabilities are underpinned by adequate quality sleep. Unfortunately, when we don't sleep enough, if we were to sleep for 6 hours per night for 2 weeks, cognitive performance drops equivalent to a decrease in IQ of about 15 points. That's actually equivalent to going in an entire night without sleep. It's also equivalent to perhaps smoking on a certain type of legal drug, which I won't mention in this company. But when we don't sleep enough, we also see problem-solving ability decreases by over 60%. When leaders don't sleep enough, their teams report that their environments are less psychologically safe because the leader's emotional intelligence is impaired. About 30% of adults report sleep problems, though. It is a huge issue. So what are we going to do about that? Well, I don't have enough time to go into immense detail. I've got some tips I'm going to share. But simply put, many of us would benefit from getting a little bit more sleep. Often people ask me, how much sleep do I need? Well, the amount of sleep that humans need is normally distributed. You might hear people talk about most people needing 8 hours of sleep. Well, that is the average. Actually, the vast majority of people are within one standard deviation of that average. And in practice, that means they need 7 to 9 hours of sleep. But if you're curious about how much sleep you need, you could just ask yourself 2 questions, and it'll give you a pretty good idea of where you fall in that band. The first question is this: can you wake up without an alarm at about the time that you need to, roughly? Secondly, can you get through the day without feeling so sleepy that you have to rely on stimulants like caffeine or stress? If you can answer yes to both of those questions, you're probably getting enough sleep. If you answer no to one of them, you might benefit from nudging your sleep and getting slightly more. Now, I could do an entire session all about sleep, and I often do. But these are my top 10 tips for improving sleep. And please, unfortunately, I don't have time to go through all of them in detail, but please feel free to take a picture. As I mentioned, I'm very happy to share the slides. There's also all kinds of resources online that you'll be able to access, and I go into detail about each of these tips. But if you're struggling with sleep, if you feel that you're answering no to at least one of those questions and you'd like to get a little bit more, these 10 top tips represent a really practical, straightforward starting point. Before we close, though, I do want to talk about recovery during the day too. Now, when was the last time that you took a break during your workday? According to some data, 50% of people never do. But it's clear that our brain really needs a break. So we can see from research that when we take a break, our well-being improves at a neurophysiological level. We see in particular that people's stress decreases. When people take a break during the day, they take breaks between meetings, we also see improved performance. We see something called positive frontal alpha asymmetry, which basically means that they're more engaged. And if you're going to take a break during the workday, I'd suggest that you look out and you try and create a break that's got at least one of these 4 characteristics. And again, this sounds quite intuitive, and in many ways it is, but try and make sure that your break is relaxing. This means that your cognitive and your physical load decreases. Ideally, try and find a break where there's some type of social component. There's something called the social facilitation effect, and it describes how we perceive challenges as easier if we feel a level of support from people who care about us, who are genuinely invested in us. And it seems that even bringing to mind a supportive person has this effect. But even better, you could send them a text, maybe give them a call. Thirdly, the most effective breaks have got some type of active component. We get up and we move around. Even 10 minutes of physical activity seems to boost resilience, improve mood. It actually affects our brain in such a way that the amygdala, the stress and fear center of the brain, is biased towards feelings of happiness and away from fear. And finally, the most effective breaks are natural. This means ideally that you get outside, you see some leaves on the trees or clouds in the sky, and that seems to activate a unique pattern of brain activity that helps us to recover, that restores us, that also decreases our levels of stress. In the average organization, about 1 in 5 people report burnout symptoms, but when they implement these simple strategies, that figure drops to just 2%. Not only that, performance increases by about 26%. Sometimes, paradoxically, our most important work doesn't look like work at all. It actually looks like rest. I think that's a message that is particularly pertinent for many of the leaders in this room, I imagine. So let's wrap this up. How can we upgrade our mental operating system? I'd suggest it begins by trying to find some time to focus in that high cognitive gear. Secondly, it's about reducing some time in that cognitive middle gear, applying some of those tactics to improve efficiency, to rescue some time. And then, even if it's just a couple of minutes between your meetings, try and implement some of those relaxing, active, social, natural breaks. You'd be amazed at the effect it can have. Sometimes it feels like well-being and performance are in conflict with each other, but I'm absolutely convinced they're not. Now, again, I recognize that financial metrics are not necessarily going to be the outcome measure that everyone here is optimizing for. However, it can provide us with a useful tool to understand how some of these ideas can make a really tangible difference. And there was a great study done that was published last year that got what's called a hypothetical basket of stocks. So they imagined they'd looked at this basket of shares in companies where they had very high well-being. And they compared that with an index fund called the S&P 500, which is kind of the top performing 500 companies in North America. And they found that companies with high well-being outperformed the S&P 500 by about 20 percentage points. It can feel like investing in your well-being might be compromising your leadership performance. But I'm absolutely convinced that's not the case. And I hope that at this point you are too. Rather, I'm convinced that in the future of work, it's going to be well-being that fuels business, leadership, success. Thank you.